Hey everyone, and welcome to the course. My name is Daniel Buckley, and I'll be your instructor. In this course, we are going to be learning the Godot game engine. Okay, Godot is a game engine that is rising rapidly in popularity as it is a very versatile platform in order to build 2D, 3D games, pretty much whatever sort of game you want to create, you can do that with Godot. And throughout this course, we are going to be learning from the ground up how to go from having no knowledge whatsoever to creating your first ever game. Now, Godot is a free to use and open source engine which has been around for quite a while now. And as the years go on, they are adding ever more features. So this engine is consistently getting upgraded and worked upon, which is very exciting as if you are someone that is looking to get into game development, then Godot is a very highly recommended engine to begin with, as it is quite user-friendly, it is very lightweight, and it also has its own included code editor, so you don't have to download any other external programs. Everything's self-contained in the engine, so you can get started right away. Now, in this course, we are going to cover a wide range of different topics. First of all, learning the Godot editor. Okay, we're going to install Godot, and then we are going to have a look at the editor itself. This is the piece of software that we are going to be spending all of our time in, creating our game, writing our code, dragging around our nodes and scenes, modifying all of those. So we're going to get an understanding of how each of these different windows work and how they are used in order to create a game. Then we are going to learn the fundamentals as well as 2D. So we're going to be learning about nodes, scenes, tools, the idea of parenting, and how to use cameras. Then once we understand the fundamentals and we know how to work with them inside of 2D, we're going to jump over to a 3D environment and look at how we can basically create our games inside of a 3D world. So we're going to be looking at 3D models, we're going to be looking at applying materials to those models, as well as lighting, okay? All the fundamentals you need for creating 3D games. And then we are going to jump into scripting. Zenva is an online learning academy with over 1 million students. We feature a wide range of courses, for people who are just starting out, or for people who just want to learn something new. The courses are also very versatile, allowing you to learn in really whatever way you want. You can choose to view the online video tutorials, read the included lesson summaries, or follow along with the instructor with the included course files. Alright, now let's get started with the first lesson. Welcome everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at installing the Godot game engine. So here I am on godotengine.org. This is Godot's website and is where you want to go if you want to download the engine. So here I am on the homepage, and all I'm going to do is go down to where we have this download latest button right here, okay? Because we want the latest version of Godot, which comes with all of the cool new features and bug fixes, okay? So we do want to be up to date with that. So I'm going to click on download latest right here, and that is going to take us over to our downloads page. And as you can see here, it says download Godot for Windows. Now I am using Windows, but if you are using Mac or Linux, it should say Mac or Linux right here. Then what we can do is click on the blue Godot engine button right here, and that should begin the download of the files. Now, the good thing about Godot is that it is a very lightweight engine. Compared to many of the others out there on the market, Godot is only really around 50 to 100 megabytes in size. So as you can see, my download is pretty much complete right now, and it is very portable as well, okay? You don't have to download and install a bunch of files into your hard drive and all of that. Rather, it is just one simple executable that you can click and drag to anywhere on your computer. If you want to store it on a USB and launch Godot from there, you can easily do that. So now that the file has finished downloading, we can click on it and open it up. Now, this opens up in a zip file, and basically what we have here are two different executables. We have the main engine right here, which is around 100 megabytes in size, and the console. Now, with Godot, we don't really need to worry about the console right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click and drag on the main executable right here and drag it out to extract it. Now, I recommend storing this somewhere such as your documents, and you can of course then create a shortcut to open it up, or you can just open up the executable by double clicking on it, which we can do right now. So if I double click on this executable, it is going to open up the Godot project manager right here. And if you get a pop-up like this, we can just click cancel because we don't want to worry about, importing any projects just yet. So here we are in the Godot engine project manager. Now, this isn't the program where we're going to be creating our games. Rather, the project manager is in charge of managing our projects. Basically, it lists out all of the different projects that we've created on our computer, as of course you will be creating many in the future for all your different game ideas. And this is where we can, first of all, create new projects, open up existing projects, check to see which versions and manage version control, as well as removing projects if we no longer need them, okay? This is just a nice little piece of software which centralizes all of our different Godot games. So, in the next lesson, what we are going to do is work on setting up our first Godot project and opening it up. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be working on setting up our first Godot project. So here I am inside of the Godot Engine Project Manager, and if you don't have this window open, then all you need to do is find your Godot executable, double click on it, and that should open up the project manager right here. Okay, now this is a program which basically allows us to create new Godot projects. It allows us to basically open up other ones, delete them if we no longer need them. It's just a way of centralizing all of our different Godot projects. So, how do we create a new one? Well, first of all, we want to go to the top right corner of the window and click on the New Project button right here. This is going to open up another window right here, which allows us to set up a few things. First of all, we can create a project name. And for this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call this, let's just call this Intro to Godot. And then next, we need to choose our project path. And this is going to determine where our project files are going to be stored. Now, by default, it should be in your documents folder, which generally is probably a good place. But if you wish, you might also want to go ahead and create your own dedicated folder for your Godot projects. So you can go ahead and do that by clicking on Browse and then navigating to the respective folder, okay? But for me, I'm going to store it here in Documents, and then we can click just above here where it says Create Folder. And what that's going to do is create a brand new folder in Documents called Intro to Godot. So we can click that. There we go. And now it should have a green tick saying that we are allowed to save it here. And apart from that, we can click Create and Edit. And what that's going to do is it's going to close down the project manager and open up the Godot engine. And here we are inside of the Godot engine, okay? As you can see, there are a lot of different buttons and text labels and things that may be a bit confusing to start off with, but in the next lesson, we are going to be looking at what each of these different windows do, what the buttons do, and how we can navigate around the engine. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then in the next lesson. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at exploring and understanding the Godot editor. So when we went ahead and created our project, we have this window which opens up, and this is where we are going to spend all of our time making our game, writing our code, and testing it out. So it's a good idea to get an understanding of what this piece of software is, how we can navigate around it, and what each of these things on screen do. So first of all, Godot, the main chunk of what you can see right now is separated into a bunch of different windows, okay? You can see here that we have these different rectangles which are snapping together. And if we click and drag on the lines between the windows, we can resize them. As you can see here, we just click and drag between these two windows to resize them. And this allows us to basically rearrange and resize the different elements to fit your needs and to fit your preferences. Now, what do these different windows actually do? Well, first of all, down here in the bottom left, you can see that we have a little tab that says File System. Now, the file system is basically like your file explorer on your computer, and this basically allows us to see all of the different folders and files that make up our project. So when we start writing down code or importing 3D models, textures, audio files, those get stored down here in the file system, and it allows us to create subfolders to store them in and just organize our project. You can see we have one file right here, which is called icon.svg, and this is pretty much just the icon for our game by default, okay? Now we will get into the file system a bit more once we start actually creating some files, creating some scenes, but right now, as you can see, it's pretty empty. Now, over here in the center of the screen, this is probably the most prominent window, and this is basically a look into our game. This is where we can basically see into our game world. This is where we can construct our levels. This is where we can construct our player scenes and everything else. And we will get a better understanding of this once we actually start creating our game. Now, as you can see right now, it has a 3D view, okay? We can see the distance right here, we can see our vanishing lines, but Godot is a 3D and a 2D engine. And you can see that at the top here, we have these 4 buttons right here with 3D highlighted. Now, if we want to switch over to 2D mode, we can just click on 2D right here, and that is going to swap this center window over to a 2D perspective. We can go back to 3D. We can even click on script right here, and that will change the middle window over into our script editor. And this is where we can basically write down our code. Now, we're not going to be focusing on code at the moment, so we can just ignore this for now and go back to, let's just say 2D, okay? Now, here in our 2D, what we can do is then go over to the scene window. And the scene window right here is basically a list of all the nodes that make up our game. Now, the way Godot works is with nodes, okay? You can think of pretty much everything as a node, and a node can have children nodes, and those nodes can have children nodes in of themselves. We are going to be looking at what nodes are and how they interact with each other in a future lesson, but right now, just know that everything in your game is made up of nodes. And what that means is at the top, there needs to be a root node. And as you can see here, it says create root node. We can create a 2D scene, a 3D scene, a user interface, or other. Now, this is a 2D scene we're working with right now. So I'm going to click on 2D scene right here, and that is going to create ourselves a node. Now, you'll see if I select this node, over here on the right-hand side in the inspector window, we have this information appear, okay? So I can click anywhere else to deselect it, and if I select the node 2D, it appears with information right here. Now, the inspector is basically like looking into whatever node we have currently selected. So if we were to select, for example, a player node, then we would see all of the player's information, such as its position, its stats, and any of the other properties that we might want to modify with it. So you can see on our node 2D right here, we have a bunch of these little drop-down tabs that we can look into, such as transform, which gives us our position, rotation, scale, and depending on the node, it's going to have different properties, such as a sprite node is going to have the ability to assign a texture, a mesh instance node is going to have the ability to assign a 3D model, and etc. So for right now, just know that on the left-hand side here in the scene window is where we have a list of all of our nodes, and if we select a node in the inspector, that is where we can actually modify its properties. And if it is a node that has a visual aspect to it, such as a player, an enemy, a tile, etc., it is also going to appear here in the middle in this scene viewport window. Now, how do we actually play our game? Well, at the top right corner here of our screen, you'll see we have a few different buttons. First up, we have the play button. Now, if we click on that, it's going to ask us to confirm our default scene. So we'll just go select current, and it's going to ask us to save our scene first. And I'm just going to save this as our test scene, hit save, and it's going to launch up our game window right here. Now, this is pretty much a window which is going to be our game as it is. Now, to get out of this, we can just click on the X on this window, or we can click on the stop button at the top right corner of the editor, and that's going to close that out. Now, down here in the file system, you'll see that we have added a new file to our file system, and that is our testscene.tscn, okay? Now, we're going to get into scenes in a future lesson as well as nodes, But for now, just know that a scene is basically a collection of nodes. Apart from that, we also have the output right here at the bottom. So when we press play on our game, the output opened up. And this is basically a window which can relay error messages or warnings that we might want to be aware of, okay? So if there's some problem in our game, the output right here is going to open up and it is going to display in red, what problem has occurred. So that is a quick overview of the Godot engine editor right here. As well, we also have some menu buttons at the top here. So scene, we can choose to create a new scene. We can open a scene. We can save the current scene we are in. Project, we have our project settings button right here, which opens up this window. And this is where you can manage a lot of the background settings for your project, such as the name, how big you want the window to be, some rendering and texture settings that you might want to get into a bit later on. So yeah, project settings is an important window, but we're not going to be focusing on it just yet. In the next lesson, we are going to be looking at understanding what is a node and what is a scene, because those are two vitally important things for understanding how the Godot engine works. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then. Hey everyone, and welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at how we can navigate around our scene in the Godot engine. So in the center here, we have our main scene viewport, and this is basically like a window into our game, okay? Looking at our environment, and it allows us to basically create stuff, drag stuff in, move stuff around. But how do we ourselves navigate this environment? Well, in 2D mode right here, all we need to do is hold down middle mouse and drag, okay? And as you can see, we can middle mouse and drag to basically pan around this screen. Now, there's not a lot to look at, but you can see we have these lines right here, and we can easily pan around like so. And if we want to zoom in, we can just use the scroll wheel and to zoom in, and scroll down to zoom out, okay? Now, what about if we are in 3D? Well, let's hop over to 3D at the top here by clicking on the 3D button. That's going to swap us over into this 3D environment right here. And we can hold middle mouse, and as you can see, if I hold middle mouse and move my mouse around, it sort of rotates around the center, okay? We are orbiting around whatever we are currently focused on. And if I hold down right mouse, our camera switches into this sort of first-person perspective where we can look around as if we are playing a first-person game. And as long as I am holding right mouse button, I can then use the W, A, S, and D keys to fly around, okay, as you can see right here. We can use E to go up, Q to go down, and fly like so. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then in the next lesson. Hey everyone, in this lesson, we are going to be looking at how we can import some assets that we are going to be using throughout the course. So an asset is basically a file which we can use in our game, okay? Anything from textures to 3D models, audio clips, sound effects, scripts, any file that we can store on our computer and use in our game. Now, for this project, we are going to be using a couple sprites, which are basically 2D textures that we are going to be using for 2D games. So in the course files tab of this course, there should be a zip file which contains the assets needed for this course. So go ahead, download that, and then when you open up that zip file, you just want to extract the contents, and you should then have a folder called sprites, okay? And inside of sprites, you should have a player sprite and a coin sprite. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to go over into Godot right here, go down to the file system, we are going to right click, we are going to go new folder, and we're going to create a new folder called, we'll call this one out sprites, okay? Hit enter, and as you can see, here we have a brand new folder. Now what we can do is import our assets and store them inside of sprites right here. So I'm going to open up that folder once again, which contains my coin and player, and I'm just going to click and drag into the sprites folder like so. And as you can see, we can then open it up and we have our player sprite. Let's do the same thing for the coin. There we go. So now in our file system here, we have a sprites folder which contains coin and player. And the process for importing other assets such as audio files, 3D models, textures, it works in the exact same way. Okay, you just need to click and drag into your file system, and then those assets are going to be stored in your project files and pretty much ready for you to use. Hey everyone, in this lesson, we are going to be looking at the concept of nodes and scenes inside of Godot. Now, it's important to note that everything in your Godot project, in your Godot game, is made up of nodes, okay? Your player, your enemies, your environment, your lights, your backgrounds, your camera, everything that can have a position in space or that can contain some sort of logic behind it is made up of a node. And nodes can have children nodes, which can have children nodes. So pretty much Godot is based off a hierarchy of nodes, and we're going to look at how we can create those and how they work. So over in the scene window right now, you can see we already have a node which we created, and this is what's known as the root node. Okay, this is basically the upmost node in our scene, and this is going to contain everything else that we want to include in this scene right here. And you can think of a scene as a collection of nodes that can be instanced at any time. Okay, so for example, your levels, you might have a level 1, level 2, level 3. Each of those are going to be its own scene, which we are going to load in whenever we want to play them. But scenes can also extend to other sets of nodes that we might want to have repeated instances of, such as our player. We might want to have our player in level 1, in level 2, and that could be then a scene as well. The same goes for enemies, okay? You probably want to have dozens of enemies at once in your game, and the easy way to do that is by making one enemy, saving it as a scene, and then spawning that scene in multiple times. Okay, we'll have a better understanding of how this works in just a bit. Let's look at nodes. So we have our node 2D right here, which is our root node for this scene. If we select it, you'll see that over in the inspector, we can have a look inside of that node and view and modify its properties, okay, such as its transform position, rotation, and scale. Although for the root node, you don't really want to be modifying the position, rotation, or scale for this. Generally, with your root node, you just want to leave it as is, so we're not going to touch anything with that. But what we can do is also go ahead and create some new nodes. So let's click on the plus at the top left corner of our scene window, and that is going to open up the Create New Node window. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of different nodes here we can choose from, and if we go down to where it says Node 2D, we have a little drop-down arrow, which if we click, is going to show us all the different types of 2D nodes we can choose from. And down here we have node 3D, which shows us all of the 3D nodes that we can choose from as well, okay? And control is for UI elements like text, buttons, and on-screen images. But we're not going to look at that for now. Let's focus on the node 2D nodes. And you can tell they are 2D based on the fact that the icons are blue, okay? Now let's go ahead and create ourselves a node. Let's go down to where we have Sprite 2D. And as you can see, we have a little description down here, which is a general purpose sprite node. Let's click create. That's going to create a brand new node as a child of the root node. And that is the way this all works, okay? A node hierarchy. Nodes are going to have children, which basically inherit their position, rotation, and scale. And nodes can have pretty much as many children as they want. And even those children nodes can have children nodes of themselves, okay? It can get pretty complicated once you have big scenes. So we have our Sprite 2D right here. So at the moment it is called Sprite 2D, but let's rename it to something that's a bit easier to understand. So I'm going to double click on the sprite name, on the node name I mean, and we can then rename it to something such as player, okay? Now, you can also see what type of node a node is by looking at the icon, okay? So we have this little smiley face for the sprite node, or if you don't know the icon, you can go over to the inspector and have a look at what type of node it is right here. Now, this is a Sprite 2D node, which means it renders a sprite, and a sprite is essentially just a texture that we are rendering in our game. So what we can do is go over to the texture property of our sprite 2D node, and you see right here it says empty, and this means that we can assign a sprite. So I'm going to go down to my file system, and you'll see here that we have our player.png. Well, all I'm going to do is just click and drag that into the texture property right here, and when I let go, you'll see over in our scene viewport right here, we have our player texture or our player sprite rendering on screen. Okay, so we can zoom into that to have a better look, and there we go. So our player sprite is now rendering at this node right here. And if we go over into the transform property of our node 2D, you can see we can modify the position on the X and the Y axis. Okay, the X axis is horizontal and Y is vertical. You can think of it like a graph. So I can go to the X position here and change that property to, let's just say 50. And as you can see, we are now 50 pixels to the right. If I go negative 150, we are now negative 150 pixels from the center of our root node. Okay, our root node is directly in the center of the graph right here, with our player being positioned relative to it. So we can even modify our Y position to be, let's just say 50, or we'll make it, let's just say 70. And there we go. Our player is now 70 pixels down and 150 pixels to the left. We can also modify our rotation if we want. Okay, this is in degrees, so you can do a full 360. But I'm just going to keep that at 0, and scale here modifies the size. So if I make this 2 on the X, you can see it is then 2 times as large. Let's bring that back down to 1. Okay, so now that we know how to create nodes, let's look at the idea of scenes. So right now in our test scene here, we have our player. Now let's just say we want to have, multiple different players in our scene, or enemies, or rocks, or trees, or anything that you want to have multiple instances of, yet are at their core the same thing. Well, what I'm going to do is select our player, go Control D to duplicate it, then we can go over into transform. Let's give it a position change of, we'll go negative 50, we'll go negative 100, so the player is a bit to the left, and we have now created 2 player nodes. Now we can also go ahead and duplicate that again, and another way to duplicate is by just right-clicking the node and going down to duplicate. Okay, you can then change that transform position to be, let's just say 100 on the Y. So now we have 3 players in our test scene. Okay, well, let's just say with our player, we want to change their color. How do we go about doing that? Well, we can select our player node, we can go down to the visibility drop down here, and change where it says modulate. And modulate is basically a color multiplier. So we can then change our color here. Okay, we can just mess around with these settings here until we find a color that we like. There we go, like green. And then let's just say, we want all of our players to be the exact same. So let's go through and do the exact same thing to this other player here. Okay, we can change their color. And as you can see, it's going to take a bit of time if you have a lot of stuff. And you can also think of this as if you have, let's just say you have a 3D environment and you have a bunch of trees in your level, okay? And you want to basically make a change to all of those trees. Let's just say, the game's changed a bit and you want these trees to have more flowers, or you want these trees to be able to sway in the wind. Well, you'd have to go through every single tree node and apply those changes, okay? And that can take time depending on how many you have. If you have a bunch of collectibles in your game and you want to change the speed of the collectibles animation, that could take you a long time going through hundreds of collectibles. So a better way of doing this is by turning our player into a scene. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these other 2 player nodes right here. Let's bring that modulate color back to white so our player no longer is green. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select our player node. I'm going to right click it, and I'm going to go down to where it says save branch as scene. Okay, we're going to click that. We can then give our player scene a name. I'm going to call it player, hit save. And then down here in our file system, you'll see that we have a brand new file called player.tscn. Now, if I double click on that, that is going to open up a brand new scene window here. As you can see at the top, we have 2 tabs. We have test scene and we have player. And you can see that in our player scene, the root node is that sprite node. Now, what we can do is if we go back to our test scene here, we can drag our player.tscn from our file system into our test scene here. Okay, we can drag in a bunch of them if we wish. Now, let's do the same thing as before. Let's go ahead and change the player's color. Well, we could go ahead and change the visibility and all that, but instead what we are going to do is we are going to make a change to our player scene, okay? Because remember, all of these nodes right here are an instance of our player scene, okay? Everything that we change in our player scene gets applied to these nodes because they are basically a creation of the player scene blueprint. So if we go over to our player scene, what we can do, select that node, go down to visibility, go modulate. Let's change this color to, we'll make it a sort of a reddish pink color like so. And if we save it with Control S, go back to our test scene, you can see that every single player node is now this red color. And that is because their properties are inheriting from that player scene, okay? And with scenes, we could add a bunch of different nodes here. So if I right click on player, I can go add child node. And let's just say as a child of this player, we want another sprite. So I can go sprite 2D, find that in the list, create that. Let's set the texture this time to be coin, okay? And we might then want to go transform. We might want to move the coin, let's just say just above the player's head. So I'm just going to go -50. There we go. We got the coin above the player's head. And as you can see here, it is a child of player. So wherever player goes, this sprite will follow as well. We can save that, go back to our test scene. And as you can see, every instance of that player scene now has that change applied. Hey everyone, in this lesson, we are going to be looking at the different tools that we can use in order to move, rotate, and scale our nodes. Now, we already know that if we select a node, we can go over into the inspector, down to transform, and we can modify the position, rotation, and scale properties right here. But, you know, this can be a bit annoying if we're trying to specifically position something. We don't always know exactly where in the world we want to put it based on a number. So what we can also do then is with a node selected, we can go to the top left corner of our scene viewport and you see there are these 4 tools, okay? We have the select mode, we have the move mode, we have the rotate mode, and we have the scale mode, okay? Now we can select these tools by just left clicking on them. And if I click the select mode, what this means is I can select a node whenever I click on it. As you can see, I can click on a node and it becomes highlighted. Now, with the select tool, we can then select a node, and then we can go over to the move mode, for example, and you can see that it changes a bit. We have now this little gizmo on screen which has 2 arrows, a red arrow pointing to the right and a green arrow pointing down. This basically means that we can modify the position of this node. So if I click and drag on it now, as you can see, I am now basically moving it around. So I can move it over here, move it over here. And we can also use our keyboard shortcuts to navigate between these. So if we want to go back to the select mode, we can just press Q on our keyboard to select a node. We can then press W to go to the move tool and move it around. Now, as well as this, we also have the rotate mode, which is this third button right here with the keyboard shortcut of E. And basically this means if we click and drag on a node, we can then rotate it around like so, okay? And if we press S or go to the scale mode right here, we can click and drag to change the size of this sprite. And as you can see, we can click and drag on these individual boxes. So if I click and drag on the red one, it scales it along the x-axis. And if I click and drag along the green box, it scales along the y-axis. So let's just rotate that back into its normal orientation. Go back to the move tool, move that around a bit. And with the move tool, if you want to move it along a specific axis, you can just click and drag on these lines as well, okay? So I can click and drag on the red arrow to move it along specifically, move it specifically along the x-axis, or I can click and drag on the green arrow to move it specifically along the y-axis, okay? Just like that. So that is a look at the select, move, rotate, and scale tools inside of Godot. Okay, so as a bit of a challenge, this is what I want you to attempt. I want you to first of all create a brand new Sprite 2D node with the coin texture. Okay, we have those two textures, we have the player and the coin. And then I want you to duplicate, position, rotate, and scale those nodes in order to match the image on the right-hand side. So you can see over there we have 6 different nodes positioned, rotated, and scaled in a certain order like so. So that is your challenge. Have a go at that, and I'll be right back to see how you're done. Alright, so I hope you had a go at that challenge. Pretty much what we want to do is, let's just pan over here so we have a bit of room. We first of all want to create our Sprite 2D node. Now, in order to do that, we could go ahead, click on the plus, create the node here. But an easy way of doing that is, if you already know what sprite you're going to use, we can go down to the file system, click our coin.png and just drag that into our scene. And as you can see, it's going to automatically create a brand new Sprite 2D node. It's going to assign the texture and give it a name of coin, which is great. So what we want to do now is we pretty much want to select this coin, press W to go to the move tool, move it up here a bit, press Control D to duplicate that. We then want to move this one down a bit here, and then we want to then go Control D again, move this one over here to the right. We then want to press S to go to the scale tool. Now, as you can see, it's a bit hard to get the right scale, so it's even. So what we can do is hold down Shift, and that is going to scale uniformly along all axes. So we can scale this one down here a bit, go back to the move tool, move it over, Control D, move this one over here, Control D once again, move this over here. We can then scale this up a bit, and we can then press E for the rotate tool, and we can click and drag to rotate this around. Now, you might not be able to get a proper rotation on this, so once again, just like with scaling, we can hold down Control this time, and this sort of snaps the rotation, as you can see here. So we can get a nice square angle like that. We can then duplicate that once more and move it over here. And there we go. We now have our little structure of nodes here, which have each been moved, rotated, or scaled into the correct position for them. And that is the challenge complete. So I recommend that you do have a go continuing to learn the select, move, rotate, and scale tools, as you'll be using them all throughout your Godot projects, okay, to align certain colliders with sprites, to dragging and dropping in pretty much any piece of, or any scene or node structure that you want for your game, such as enemies, rocks, collectibles, eventually with UI elements as well. You'll need to be knowing these tools. So yeah, have a go at that. And in the next lesson, we are going to have a further look at parenting inside of Godot. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at the concept of parenting inside of the Godot engine. Now, we've already looked at parenting in the fact that we have created nodes. So whenever you create a node, unless it is the root node, which we have right here, then you are making a child node of another. Okay, so let's start by creating ourselves a node. So I'm going to go ahead, click on the plus, and I'm going to search for Sprite. There we go, create the Sprite 2D node. And now, as you can see in our scene window right here, Sprite 2D isn't in line with Node 2D, okay? Rather, it has a bit of a inline right here, denoting that it is a child node. And Node 2D even has a little drop-down button right here to toggle open and close its children nodes. So in your scene, everything is going to be a child of the root node, okay? Now, we can also have children of children nodes. So if I select the Sprite 2D right here, let's assign the player.png to the texture, okay? And what we can then do is we can attach another child node to this. So what we can do for that is right-click on Sprite 2D, go Add Child Node, and let's just say for this character, we want to give them a collider. Well, we can search for Collision Shape 2D. Let's create that. And as you can see, that is then indented as well into Sprite 2D. So now Collision Shape 2D is a child of Sprite 2D. So if I select the Collision Shape node, we can then go ahead to where it says Shape, click on the little drop down here, and then we can choose something like Rectangle Shape 2D. That's going to create a blue box right here, which we can then go ahead and click and drag on these little nodes to resize. Something like that. There we go. So now we have a sprite node which has a collider on it. And then what we can do is select our sprite 2D, and if I click and drag on these arrows here to move it around, go W to get to the move tool, we can move it around and you'll see that the collision shape follows along. Now, the reason why it is following along is because if your node is a child, it is going to inherit your properties such as your position, rotation, and scale. So if I then go to the rotate tool and I rotate this around, you can see that the collision shape 2D also rotates. And if I go to the scale tool, it also scales, okay? So that's the great thing about these children nodes. So if you have a player, for example, and you want the player to be holding onto an item, well, that item, as long as it is a child of the player node, it's going to follow that player along wherever it goes. And a good way of having a camera follow the player is by making the camera a child of the player. And that basically means that wherever your player goes, the camera is going to be locked on them. So yeah, that is just a quick look at creating or using parenting inside of Godot. And this is going to become second nature once you start creating all of your games and all of your different scenes. So thanks for watching. Hey everyone, so far in our Godot journey, we have been looking at 2D scenes and 2D nodes. Well, Godot is a very versatile engine and it actually allows us to also create 3D games. So how do we go about doing that? Well, let's go ahead and create a brand new scene for our 3D level. And to do this, we are just going to go to the top left where we have scene and we're going to go new scene. Okay, that's going to create a brand new scene here and we need to choose a root node. Now, when creating a 3D scene, you of course need to have a root node of 3D. So we'll click on 3D scene right here. And as you can see, it's going to switch us over into 3D mode and it's going to create a node 3D. So I'm going to go up to scene, save scene as, and I'm just going to call this one our, we'll go test scene 3D. There we go. So now we have our 3D environment right here. Now, once again, to navigate around this, we can hold right mouse to look around, use the WASD keys to fly, E to go up, Q to go down, and we can then middle mouse to sort of orbit around what we are focusing on. Okay, those are the basic controls for our 3D environment right here. Now, how do we actually create stuff? Well, in 2D Godot, we have sprites to pretty much show us, some sort of visual aspect. Whereas in 3D, we can create what's known as a mesh instance node. And a mesh instance node is a node that can render a 3D object. So I'm going to click on the plus to create a brand new node. And I am going to search for mesh instance 3D right here. Click create. That's going to create a new mesh instance node. We can then go over to our inspector. Now, if you already have a 3D model that you want to use, you can just drag that in. Although for us, we can click on the little drop down here and we can choose to create a brand new basic primitive mesh. So I'm going to click on new box mesh right here. And as you can see, that is going to create ourselves a brand new cube. But yeah, we have our cube here. And just like in 2D, we can go to our move tool and we can move it along by clicking and dragging on these arrows. But you will notice that in 3D, we don't just have the X and the Y axis, but we also have the Z axis, which is the blue one right here, okay? And that is because in 2D space, we only need 2 axes in order to denote a point in space, whereas in 3D, we need 3 values, okay? The X, Y, and Z. And if we go over to our transform, drop down here, where we have our position property, you can see we now have 3 boxes to fill each of those in. Now, it is also different, the unit of measurement from 2D to 3D. In 2D, we are measuring distances in terms of pixels. So, 100 pixels may only be like the width of your character, whereas in 3D, it uses meters. And as you can see, if I click and drag along on the red axis, you can see here in the transform property, the x-axis goes from 0 over here to 1 over here, okay? That is a 1 meter distance. And we can, of course, fill this in ourselves. So let's say we want to go 5 meters along the x-axis. That brings us all the way over here. 1 meter up, that's going to bring us up here. And let's just say -2 meters back on the z. That's going to bring us over here, okay? Now, you'll see on the move tool, we also have these little squares. And if we click and drag on those, that basically moves us along a specific plane, okay? So if we click on this green one, that's going to move us along pretty much every axis but the Y. If we click and drag on the red one, that's going to move us along the Y and the Z axis. And the blue one is going to move us along the X and the Y axis, okay? Now, what we can also then do is we can rotate as well. So if we press E, we go to the rotate tool, and it does look a bit different. So we have each of these different axes that we can rotate along, like so, or we can just click and drag in the middle of this sphere to rotate it along our current viewpoint. Okay, it should be pretty intuitive once you get actually working with these tools. And again, if we press R, we have our scale tool. We can scale along each of these individual axes like so. Or if we click and drag in the center, we can scale along all of these axes. So yeah, that is a quick look at the tools that we use for 3D. Again, they're pretty much the same as 2D, yet with an extra axis added on top, okay? Because again, we are working in 3D space. Okay, so as a bit of a challenge, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go ahead and create a snowman using multiple mesh instance 3D nodes, okay, like on the image on the right hand side here. And for this, you're going to be using the selection, move, rotate, and scale tools, okay? So have a look at that image on the right, see what you need to do, and then go ahead and attempt it. And I'll be right back to see how you're done. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had to go at that challenge. So let's look at how we can accomplish it. First of all, we need to create a mesh instance node. So I'm going to click on the plus, search for mesh instance 3D. There we go. Let's create that now. And we can then go over to the inspector, go to the mesh property, click on the little drop down arrow, and we are going to go down to where we have new sphere mesh. Okay, create that just like so. We can then go Control D to duplicate it. Using the move tool, we can move up. We can then scale this down. We can then duplicate that again, and then scale that down for the head. Now for the arms, what we can do is I'm just going to duplicate one of these mesh instance nodes, and then we can go over to mesh and change that to a box mesh, okay? Move that up. We then want to scale, so we have nice thin arms, but we want to make them long, like so. And there we go. That is how we can make a snowman using these mesh instance nodes. Now, as a bonus, what we can also do is make it so that these are all the child of its own separate nodes. So if we want to make multiple instances of these snowmen, we don't have to select all three or four of these mesh instances in order to do so. And the way we can do that is by creating a brand new node 3D. Okay, create that. Let's double click on it. Let's call this one snow. And we can then select our mesh instances and drag those in as a child of snow. So pretty much click and drag on a node and hover over another to make it a child. Now, if I click on snow here, you can see everything gets selected and I can then move it like so. Okay, we can even go to the scale tool, scale everything up or down, even rotate everything around as well. So you can see, just like I mentioned before in 2D, every single positional, rotational, and scaling change we make to the parent node also gets applied to the children, okay? So we can move them around as one whole. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at materials inside of Godot. Now, first up, what is a material? Well, in 3D rendering, a material is basically a file which tells our computer what we want an object to look like, how we want something to be rendered to our screen. Okay? Now, in fact, we are already using materials right now. These mesh instances right here have a default material on them, okay? It's nothing special, nothing flashy, but it is, as you can see here, casting shadows. It is detecting where the light is coming from and rendering it to our screen with the correct shading. So we already have a material here, but you probably don't want your things to look like this. You probably want them to have a bit more color, maybe even some texture. So what we're going to do is create a material. So let's go down to our file system here. I'm going to right click and create a new folder called materials. And then inside of this materials folder, we want to create a new material. And to do that, we can right click, go new, and then resource. Now, a resource is pretty much what Godot calls their assets, okay? And as you can see, there are a bunch of different resources that we can create. So I'm going to search for material, okay? And you can see here, there are a bunch of different materials. So what we want to do is go down to where we have a standard material 3D, okay? And this basically allows us to do what we want. So click create. We need to give it a name. I'm just going to call this one our test material since we are going to be changing a few things around on it. Hit save. And if we open up our materials folder, you'll see that we have a test material.tres, okay? And there it is. Now, if I select this test material, you'll see that over in the inspector, we all of a sudden have a bunch of different settings, okay? Transparency, shading, vertex color, albedo. We have all these things to modify for this material. So there are a lot of things that you can change about it, such as the texture, the roughness, the shininess, the color, the transparency. And I'll give you the opportunity to go through and do that yourselves, as there are plenty of different things to change. But for us, we are just going to change the albedo, which is the color of the material. So I'm going to open up the albedo drop down here. I'm going to select the color property. And we can then go ahead and change this to something. Let's just say we want to make it green. Now, if you're having a bit of trouble selecting the color that you're trying to get, you can go over to where we have the HSV, and I think this is probably my favorite color picker. So we can choose the hue, choose our saturation, and then our vibrance. Okay, so I'm going to choose let's just say a greenish color. Whoops, greenish color right there. There we go, a nice vibrant green. As you can see, we have this little preview window which shows us our changes. We can even go down to roughness and change the roughness value. And if I drag that down, you can see it gets really shiny, because if something is not rough at all, then it is smooth. Thus, it's going to reflect a lot of stuff. So let's bring that roughness down to around 0.2, so we have nice specular highlights. All right, now how do we actually apply this to our mesh? Well, what we can do is just click and drag on the material and hover over the mesh that we want to apply it to. So we can click and drag on our head, our body, our legs, and our arms. And there we go. And as you can see, we now have this material applied, and automatically it makes our snowman look quite a bit different, okay? We have a more soft, I'd say reflective, plasticky looking substance than we had before. And we can even select our material and change these properties live. So let's say we want to bump up the roughness to make it look more of a matte color. We can bring the roughness all the way down, so it is now pretty much reflective, but you can't really see the reflectiveness that much here. So bring the roughness up a tiny bit. Go to metallic. We can change the metallic value, and as you can see, if I bring that all the way up, it pretty much looks like it is a nice shiny steel ball. But I'm going to bring that down a bit here. And yeah, have fun just going through changing these different things. We even have rim, which is going to give us a Fresnel effect on the outside of our thing here, as you can see. So yeah. Okay, so as a bit of a challenge, this is what I want you to do. Below, we have these three materials that I've gone ahead and created, and I want you to try and replicate them. Now, the one on the left is probably one, that we've seen so far. We have an albedo, we have a high roughness. Then the one in the middle is using transparency. So I want you to explore and experiment with the transparency settings of the materials. And then on the right-hand side, we are assigning a texture to this material. So I want you to go ahead and try and replicate these three. And in the next lesson, we're going to go over how we can accomplish those. So thanks for watching, and have a go at the challenge. Alright, so I hope you had a go at that challenge. Pretty much what we want to do is first of all create our three spheres. So I'm going to go ahead, create a mesh instance 3D here, assign that mesh to be a new sphere. We can then duplicate that and make two more on either side. There we go. So now that we have our spheres, we then need to create materials for them. So inside of our materials folder, I'm going to right click on it, go new, resource. I'm going to go down to where we have standard material 3D, and I'm going to call this one pink ball. Okay. Now for our pink ball, we can click and drag on that sphere. As you can see, it doesn't really change much since the default material is very similar to the one that gets assigned when we actually create the mesh. But we can click and drag it on. We can then go over to the inspector, change the albedo color here. I'm going to make that a nice vibrant pink, something like that. And we can then change the roughness. Actually, no, keep the roughness at 1. I reckon. I think that's going to be a good idea. There we go. Now we can move on to the second ball, and this is going to be transparency. So I'm going to right click on materials folder, go new, resource, standard material 3D. I'm going to call this one blue transparent. Okay. Or technically translucent. So I'm going to click and drag on the center one here. We can then go in the inspector down to albedo. Let's just give our ball its blue color real quick. There we go. And then we can go over to the transparency drop down here. And right now transparency is set to disabled, so we want to click on that drop down and change it to alpha. Now what we can do is go back to our albedo, open up that color again, and you'll see here we have our RGBA values, red, green, blue, and alpha. And alpha is basically transparency. So we can click on drag on that slider to bring that down in transparency, as you can see here. And now if we pan our camera around, we can actually see through our ball. Now with transparency, there are a bunch of different types of modes for transparency. So if I click on the transparency drop down again, you see we have alpha, alpha scissor, alpha hash. So if we go alpha hash, for example, you can see that it basically has this solid blue mixed with totally invisible, okay? So it gives the appearance of transparency. And depending on, the rendering situation, it may be better performance for your game to do it this way. But I'm going to switch that back to alpha. We also have our blend mode, which basically determines how it renders the transparency based on what is behind it. So if we go add, that means it's going to add this blue color to whatever it is behind. Subtract subtracts it. So as you can see, it has this weird looking effect right here. And multiply is multiplying the colors together. Okay, so that's going to make it a bit darker. But typically, mix is what you were looking for the blend mode. Now, for our final sphere, we are going to be applying a texture. So I'm going to right click on materials once again, go new, resource, standard material 3D, and I'm going to call this one our texture ball. Okay, click and drag on the sphere, and to apply a texture, what we need to do is go down to where we have albedo, and you'll see here we can of course change the color, but we can also assign a texture, and that is going to be the flat color texture for our ball. And for this, I'm just going to be using our player sprite, so we can just click and drag that in here, and there we go. So as you can see, we have our player right here. We can even click on the color property, and we can actually modify the color that is sort of being multiplied by the texture, okay? So if we want the texture to look more blue, we can do that. If we want to make it look more red, we can change it to red. Okay, and that is pretty much the basis of materials inside of Godot. Once again, there are a lot of different settings here for you to change, and I just hope that you go ahead and experiment with these, as you can create some pretty interesting looking materials for your games. So thanks for watching. Hey everyone, in this lesson we are going to be looking at lighting inside of the Godot engine. Okay, now when working in 3D, lighting is very important as it sets the mood and it sets the theme of your game. So how do we create lights inside of Godot? Well, first of all, let's get an actual mesh in here so we can see what effect it has on the actual environment. So I'm going to click on the plus, I'm going to create a new mesh instance 3D, and we can change that to be a sphere. Okay, there we go. So we've got our mesh here. Now let's go ahead and apply some lighting to it. Now, if we click on the plus and we search for light, you'll see there are 3 different types of lights we can create. We can create a directional light, an omni light, and a spotlight. Now let's start with directional light. So I'm going to select it and click create. Now, a directional light is basically like the sun, okay? Our sun shoots down rays of light parallel to each other, and that's essentially what a directional light does. It casts a light in a single direction. So if we go to the rotate tool here with the directional light selected, you can see that we have this white arrow pointing in the direction that the light is being shone from. And you can see we even have a little sun up here in the skybox to show where it's coming from. And you'll see on our sphere here, the left-hand side is being hit by that light. And if we rotate this directional light, you can see how it changes the actual source or the direction of that light. Now, good thing about directional light is that it can be moved around anywhere in the scene, but the position does not affect where the light is coming from because it's basically coming from an infinite distance away. It's only the rotation that really matters when it comes to the directional light, okay? So you can see here we can modify our directional light rotation to modify where on the sphere it is being hit with light. Now, something else we can do with the light is many things actually. If we go over to the inspector and open up the light drop down here, you'll see there are a bunch of different settings we can change. For example, the color is, as it sounds, it's the color of the light. So if, for example, it's nighttime, you might want to have a bit more of a coldish blue light, so something like this maybe. Whereas if it's daytime, you probably want a nice, vibrant, slightly yellow-hued light, okay? And you can go ahead and modify those for whatever you wish. The energy, this is basically the intensity of the light, okay? And as you can see, if I bump this up, our sphere starts to pretty much glow if we increase the energy there. Whereas if we put it at 0, it's as if there is no light. So I'm going to bring that back up to 1. We don't really need to worry about the rest of these settings here since they are all for light baking and a much more complex lighting, so we're just going to ignore those for now. Okay, so we have our directional light. Now, what about those other light types? Well, click on the plus, and let's create what's known as an OmniLight 3D. So we'll create our OmniLight, and with this, you'll see it has a sphere, okay, this wireframe sphere on the outside. And this basically is a light that emits from a single point in all directions, okay? You can think of it like a candle, a light bulb, okay? It has a source of the light, and it emits in all directions. So what we can do is we can press W to go to our move tool. Let's move this light over here, and as you can see, it is lighting up our sphere. And this white wireframe is basically the range of the light. I mean, click and drag on this little orange node right here to basically change the range of that light. Now, to make things a bit easier to see, I'm going to go ahead and create a new mesh instance 3D. Let's set this mesh to be a plane, and that's basically like a solid ground. Let's increase that scale. Move it down a bit. There we go. Okay, so we'll select the OmniLight again. We can move it around. To have a better viewing of it, to actually see what we are casting, let's change that light color over to, I'm going to change that over to we'll change it over to a red. Okay, we'll make a nice red light here. And we can then bump up the energy a bit, and we can then see how that affects our surroundings. Okay, now it might be a bit hard to see because of the white ground, so what we can do is select our directional light, and let's bring that energy down to 0, okay? So now it's pretty much just our OmniLight shining here. And you can see we can change all the settings, the energy. Now, to change the range, we can open up the Omni drop down here and change the range. We also got the attenuation, which is basically the fall-off curve. Now, with lighting, we also have shadows, and so how do we apply those? Well, let's first of all set the energy of our OmniLight down to 0 for now, because we'll look at our directional light. Let's bring that directional light back up to 1. Now, how do we cast a shadow on this sphere onto the plane below? Well, to do that, we want to open up the shadow drop down here and just enable it. And there we go. It's pretty much done just like that. Same thing for the OmniLight. If we bump up that energy, we can go down to shadow and enable that shadow as well. And you can see there is a bit of a shadow cast here. Now, it is important to note that shadows do have some performance cost, but you shouldn't worry about that unless you have quite a few of them in your scene. Now, finally, we have one more light, and I'm just going to delete our OmniLight here and delete our directional light. And that is going to be our, if we type in light, our Spotlight 3D. Now, Spotlight is pretty much as it sounds. It is a light that emits in a cone, okay? These would be good things for headlights, street lamps. If your character is holding a torch, a spotlight would be good for that. So I'm just going to rotate this spotlight so it's facing down, And you can see if we zoom out here that there is this white cone wireframe, which basically shows us the angle, which we can modify by clicking and dragging here, as well as the range. So we can modify those two things here. We can then change the light energy, so we might want to bump that up like so. We can change the color, so let's change this to be a, we'll change this over to be a green, for example. There we go. And of course, just like with those other lights, we can apply shadows as well, and there you go. So yeah, that is just a quick look at these different lighting systems that we can use inside of Godot. We have the directional light, which acts like a sun. We have an omni light, which acts as a light source that emits in all directions, like a candle or a light bulb. And then we have a spotlight, which emits in a cone, and that acts as if it's a torch or a street lamp. So I'd recommend having a go experimenting with all these different lights, as really there is a lot to learn when it comes to lighting, so have fun experimenting with that. Hey everyone, in this lesson we are going to be looking at scripting inside of the Godot engine. Now, scripting is a very powerful thing, and it basically allows us to write code which we can use to create whatever game we wish. So, first of all, what is scripting? Well, at its core, scripting is how we can create the gameplay behaviors and logic for our game, okay? And this is done via creating what's known as a script. And a script is essentially a file which we can create in the file system, okay? So it's an asset, and this is essentially just a text document which we fill with code. And then what we can do is we can attach that script to a node, okay? Each node at the bottom in the inspector, you may have already seen this, has a script property where we can assign a single script. And then that script can do certain things to that node, okay? For example, if we have a player, we'll want to attach a player script to the player's node, where it can then influence its position based on keyboard inputs. Or if you have some sort of enemy AI, you might want to attach that to the enemy. So let's hop over into Godot right now and look at how we can create a script. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to pretty much figure out what node we want to attach our script to. Now, just for demonstrational purposes, I'm just going to select our root node right here, and I'm going to go over to the inspector, and you'll see here we have our script property, okay? And right now it is empty, meaning there is no script attached, so let's create one and attach it. Now to do this, we could right click in the file system and create it that way, or we can just click on the little drop down here next to the script property and go new script. That's going to open up this attach node script window, and this is where we can choose a bunch of different settings, but really for us, we just want to go down to where it says path. And this is where we can change the name of our script. So I'm just going to call this one intro to scripting.gd. Click create, and it is going to do two things. It's going to first of all create a brand new intro to scripting.gd file down here in our file system. And secondly, it's going to switch us over into the scripting screen, okay? Before we were in 2D, we also have 3D, and then it goes over to scripting, which is where we can write down our code. Now, there's a couple things already inside of the script editor right here. Some text, and pretty much just like Word or any other text editor, we can click around and we can type stuff in, okay? So it's pretty much a text editor, but specifically designed for the Godot scripting language, which is called GDScript, okay? If you do have any prior knowledge with programming, then just know that GDScript is very similar to Python, okay? But you don't need to know anything whatsoever about programming or coding in order to follow along with this course. We are going to go through everything from scratch. So you can see here that we have all of our code written down, which is just the default code it gives us right now. On the left-hand side, we have a list of all of the different scripts that we have, okay? So later on in your game, when you have, dozens of scripts, you'll probably want to be jumping between them to write code, edit stuff. So this is where that list will appear. And then down here, we have all of our methods, okay? Listing out our methods, and we'll get into what those are in a future lesson. And what differs this from just opening up Notepad or opening up any other word processor is because this piece of Godot is specifically designed for writing GDScript. And that means we have what's known as code formatting. And that pretty much means that whenever we write down our code, you can see that certain things are different colors, okay? We have some pink stuff, some green, some purple, some blue, okay? It colors our code based on what we are writing, okay? Because the program knows what we are doing, okay? It knows the language we are trying to write in, and it colors the code based on that. And that just makes it a lot easier to look at and identify certain things. As well, typically these sort of programs also have autocorrect, okay? Which basically means that when you're writing down code, it tries to estimate and assume what you want to do, and it will pop up with a window with a bunch of different things. So if you're not quite sure on what a certain thing was called in the language, you can begin typing it, and a box will appear, and it might have your answer right there, okay? So we'll get into all of that later on, but for now, we have our script here inside of Godot ready to be edited, okay? So we can save this, and in the next lesson, we are going to be going over the concept of variables. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be learning about variables. Now, first of all, what is a variable? Well, basically, a variable is a piece of data which we can define, read, and change the value of, okay? It's basically this piece of data that we save to memory, and we have the ability to utilize it. Now, you can think of it like a box, okay? We can give a variable a name and assign it a value, okay? And at any time, we can try and find the box that, might say player's health, and inside of that, we have a value, a number, for example. And we can look at that number so we know what it is. We can also change it, add to it, subtract it, multiply it, pretty much anything we want to do with it, okay? And there are also different types of variables, okay? There are whole numbers, decimal numbers, text. There are a bunch of different variable types that we will be going over. So let's hop over into Godot and have a look at how we can start creating some variables. Okay, so here we are inside of our script. Now, the first thing we want to do is go to the right location to start creating our variables, okay? Now, you'll see we have this extends node 2D line of code right here. Pretty much, we just want to go to a line or a couple lines underneath it, okay? And what we are going to do is we are going to create a variable. Now, let's just say we want to create a variable that keeps track of a player's score, okay? Well, to do that, we have to define the variable. Now, to define a variable, we first of all have to write down the keyword var for variable, add a space. We need to give the variable a name, so I'm going to write down score, and then we can go equals and give it a value. Now, let's say score equals 0 by default, okay? And there we go. Var score equals 0. Var, which is the keyword which defines a variable, score, which is what we are calling our variable, equals 0, okay? We are assigning it a value of 0. So we've created a variable. Now, what do we do with it? Well, for right now, let's just print it to the output so we can actually see what it is. Now, printing basically means we are logging a message to the output down here, okay? You see at the bottom left here, we have the output. We can click on that, and that's going to open up the console, the output. And pretty much we can log messages here. Whenever we get errors in our code, that is where they'll appear as well. So you'll probably want to have this open most of the time when you're starting out, as it's very handy in catching all the little errors that you might write down. So how do we print our score variable down here to the output? Well, we want to go down to this thing right here where it says func ready, okay? And this here is basically what's known as a function. We're going to get into what functions are a bit in the future, but right now just know that a function is a block of code that can be called at any time. And the ready function gets called right at the start of the game to initialize stuff. So what we can do is remove this line of code where it says pass and write down print in 2 brackets score, okay? Now what this is going to do is it is going to print, and then in between these 2 brackets here, we want to basically add in what we want to print, in our case, score. So Control S to save, and then press the play button, and let's see what happens. Okay, I press play, and if we look over here in the output, we can see the number 0. Now we can stop playing that. We can then change score, for example, to be 5. Let's save that, press play, and down here in the output, as you can see, out it prints 5, which is great. Okay, so we have the ability to create variables and print them out. Now, we also need to go over the concept of variable types. Now, the way Godot is, or the way GDScript I mean is that it is what's known as a dynamic language, meaning we don't have to hard define specifically what we are doing and what we want. And that allows us a lot of flexibility, but generally, I'd say it's best practice, especially early on, to define the data types of your variables. And by that, I mean, when we create a variable, we need to basically tell it what type of variable it is going to be. So in our case, we have score. And score is a number. In our case, it's going to be a whole number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So what I'm going to do is after where we write down score, I'm going to add in a colon, go space, and then write down the word int, okay, for integer. And that is a type of variable. An integer is a whole number. So this basically means that we are just defining score as being a variable that is a whole number. Now, what about other variable types? Well, let's go down to a new line here, create another variable, and this time we are going to create a variable of type float, which is a floating point number. So something that may have a decimal number in it might be the player's move speed. So I can write move speed colon float equals, and then we can say like 2.53, okay? There we go. So an integer is a whole number, a float is a decimal number. Now, you see here how I've written my variables, okay? They're all lowercase, and they have a underscore wherever there would be a space, because in programming, spaces are a big no-no, okay? If you're trying to make a name for something, you cannot have a space, otherwise that will cause an error, okay? So in variable here, we need to give it an underscore, or just have no space at all. And this type of code formatting is known as snake case, and it's generally considered the general practice when it comes to GDScript. Everything here lowercase with underscores where you would put spaces. You can see here with the ready function, we have an underscore there and a underscore for the process function. Okay, it's all lowercase. Now, as well as move speed, we also have another variable type, which is a boolean. And a boolean is a variable that has either two options, true or false. So I can create a variable here called game over of type bool, and this can be equal to true. Okay, there we go. So game over, it's going to be true, or it can be false. So true or false for a boolean, and it's very good for those things where you want an on and off state, for example. So game over is a good one. Maybe if you want to keep track of if the player has something equipped, you could have a boolean for that. And then finally, one more data type we're going to look at is a string, okay? And a string is text. Now, the way we create a string is a bit different. We have to go var, we'll just call this one ability of type string with a capital S this time. And this is going to be equal to, and we need to put 2 double quotation marks, and we can just put in here slash or some sort of ability, okay? And there we go. So the way we define a string is by using the string data type, but this one has a capital S, okay, unlike bool, float, and int. And to write down a string value, we need to put it in these quotation marks. And you can see that with our formatting, it has turned it into this sort of brownish gold color, okay, to denote that this is a string. Now, a cool thing about variables is that not only can we read them, we can also modify their values. So down here in the ready function, we're printing out score. Let's go ahead and print out move speed, okay, just so we can see what it looks like. So we can then press play, and you'll see down here in the output, we have 2.53, okay, so that's all working fine. Well, what we can do is we can change move speed. So let's say just before we want to print it, so we'll go to a new line here, we can go move speed equals, and then we can change that to something like 5.1, okay? So now, if we save that and press play, we should see 5.1 in the output because we are changing it. And that's something else that I need to go over, and that is the order of execution, okay? When it comes to pretty much every coding language, there is what's known as an order of execution. And that basically means that it runs one command at a time, okay? In our case, lines. So when the ready function gets called, it looks at its contents and it runs it from the top down, okay? So it goes move speed equals 5.1, then it prints it out. And what we can do then is also go move speed equals 500.156, and then we can print that value out as well, okay? So what do you think this is going to look like when we press play? Okay, we're going to have two things printed out, and if I press play, as you can see, 5.1, 500.5 or 0.156, okay? And that is because we are, first of all, setting move speed to equal 5.1, we are printing that value out, we are then changing move speed to equal this new number, and then we are printing it out. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to continue on with creating variables, okay? So in the previous lesson, we looked at how we can define variables up here and give them a data type, okay? A data type is basically telling the variable what type of value it can hold. In our case, for score, it is of type int, which is an integer, and that means it can hold whole numbers, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1,000, 10,000, 200, okay? Then we have move speed, which is a variable that is of type float. And a float is a decimal number, okay? This can be much more precise in terms of what numbers you can store. Then we have game over, which is of type boolean, or bool, we write here, and that is basically a variable which can be true or false, okay, on or off. And then finally, we have looked at a string variable, which is basically text, okay, and we define the value by putting it in quotation marks right here. And then down here in the ready function, which gets called right at the start of the game, you can even see there's a little comment up here which explains what the ready function does. We are basically assigning move speed to equal a new value. We are printing that new value out to the output window here. We are then changing the move speed again and printing the new value out to the output. And we also looked over the idea of order of execution, which basically means that since we are working with a computer, it has to execute one thing at a time, okay? And in our case with programming, it goes line by line. So when the ready function here gets called at the start of the game, it is first of all calling this line of code, then this line of code, then this line of code, then this line of code, okay? It goes down. And that is a core concept that you do need to keep in mind when writing your code. Now, let's remove this here, and let's look at, for example, how can we change some of these other variables. So let's say we want to change game over, okay? Let's just say something happens and the game is suddenly over. Well, we can go game over equals true, okay? And that is going to change that value from false to true. We can then print that out. So game over like so, save it, press play, and down here in the output, you can see it says true, all right? Now, we can also do the same thing for strings, okay? And to change a string variable, it's pretty much the same as everything else. We just need to go ability equals, and then in 2 double quotation marks, we can enter in a new string for this variable. And for this new string, let's just say we want to go heal, okay? A heal ability. And there we go. So we can then go to a new line, print out the ability variable, save that, press play, and there we go. It says true and heal. Okay, so as a bit of a challenge, I want you to go ahead and create 4 variables which are going to be used to define a country, okay? And each of these variables should be using a different data type, okay? And the 4 variables that you need to create is going to be a country name, a population, a highest altitude, and whether or not that country is landlocked, okay? Does that country have access to the sea? So each of those variables need to have a different data type, and then I also want you to go ahead and print all of these 4 variables out inside of the ready function so that when we press play, we can see them in the output. So have a go at that, and I'll be right back to see how you're done. Alright, so I hope you had to go at that challenge. Pretty much what we want to do is we first of all want to create our country name variable, and that is of course going to be done by using a string. So I'm going to go var, then I'm going to go country name of type string, capital S, equals, and for me I'm going to do Australia, so I'll write down Australia inside of the string variable here, alright? Now, next up, we need our country's population. and a population, that is a whole number, so that's going to be an integer. So I'm going to go var population of type int equals, and we're going to put about 25 million. 123, 123, okay? And then next up, we have the highest altitude. Now, this is going to be a variable of type float, okay? Because when it comes to measurements, you can get very fine with those, so it's probably good to have that as a floating point number. So I'm going to go var highest altitude of type float equals, and with the highest altitude, this here is going to be 2.228 kilometers, okay? Like so. Then what we need to do is have a variable for whether or not this country is landlocked. And since that is either yes or no, we are going to use a boolean for true or false. So var landlocked bool equals false. Okay, and there we go. So these are our variables that we have created. Now the next step is to go down into our ready function here, and we need to basically print each of these out. Now, the pass that is here by default, this is basically just a filler for the function, okay? If your function is empty, pass basically just is there to give it some body. So we can remove that, and we can go print country name. We can then go print population, print highest altitude, and then finally print landlocked, okay? Save that, press play, and we should see in the output here, we have all of those variables logging to the output, which is great. Okay, so we have all that set up. Now, in the next lesson, we are going to look at how we can start modifying our variables in different ways, and that is going to be done via operators. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then. Congratulations on completing the course. We just finished looking at the fundamentals of the Godot game engine. So let's have a look at what we learned throughout this course. First of all, we learned about the Godot editor. We spent some time installing the engine, creating our first project, and then having a look at what each of the different windows do and how we can navigate around. We then looked at the fundamentals of the engine, that being nodes, scenes, and the tools we can use to move those nodes and scenes around, as well as how we can do all of this inside of a 2D environment. Okay, we looked at parenting to get an overall understanding of how this engine works at its core, okay, with the fact that nodes are the fundamentals of pretty much everything in your game. We then took that knowledge and transferred it over to 3D, where we looked at creating models, applying materials to those models, and seeing what each material can do differently from one another, as well as lighting. Zenva is an online learning academy with over 1 million students. We feature a wide range of courses, for people who are just starting out, or for people just wanting to learn something new. The courses are also very versatile, allowing you to learn in really whatever way you want. You can choose to view the online video tutorials, read the included lesson summaries, or follow along with the instructor with the included course files. So thank you very much for following along with the course, and I wish you the best of luck with your future Godot games.